Welcome to the Coriolis Multilateral Thinking Fireside Chat, the first of 2021. With me, Rebecca Harding, Chief Executive of Coriolis Technologies, and Jack Harding, who is Head of Political Risk at Coriolis Technologies. Oh, I guess it's really hard making sense of 2020, but 2021 is going to be framed by its legacy. I don't think anyone has any doubt about that. It's very unlikely that trade's going to get back to its pre-pandemic levels before the end of Q1 21. And there are big shifts in supply chains to reduce dependency on one supplier. We're seeing as well heightened geopolitical tensions around technology and trade wars, and also a decoupling of technology and financial systems in the wake of the US-China trade conflict. We're seeing more economic nationalism, more COVID diplomacy, with people using COVID vaccines, countries using COVID vaccines to influence their power around the world. And all in all, an increase in economic nationalism, imperatives for sustainability, integration, disintegration of global institutions are all a legacy of the past year. Jack, let's have a think about all of this. Why, as trade professionals, do we really still need to be worried about populism and foreign policy against that backdrop?
Well, I mean, the answer is very simple. I think in the modern era, what some people are referring to as the information age, everything is connected. You don't have the same sort of delineation between military and civil capabilities anymore. It's a blend of all means, you know, there's a lot of research going on at the moment that's on precisely this. Recent book, for example, All Measures Short of War, and a lot of nation states are also prioritizing this kind of blend of civil and military capabilities. I mean, you don't really have to look too much further than recent elections in the UK and in the US that have seen significant interference, attempts to sort of disrupt democratic processes. So I think populism in particular is one of these things that can really sow the seeds of division within a country. And it's the sort of thing that, from the West's perspective, is something that could really hinder their ability to compete. So populism and foreign policy are interrelated concepts when it comes to things like trade and trade finance. You can't separate them in the modern era, I don't think.
I think it's really interesting because we've been talking about this for such a long time, and populism has been driving the trade agenda for 4 or 5 years, really, hasn't it? I mean, it's that populism that first provoked, if you like, the economic nationalism and trade wars that we've seen over the last few years. Is there any sense in which we're going to see a shift in global institutions during 2021? Are we going to see more economic nationalism in economic terms during 2021? Do you think this sort of populist tendency with foreign policy, almost bringing domestic policy into foreign policy, do you think that's a pattern that we're going to see? And do you think trade is actually the vehicle that is going to happen through?
Well, I'd probably say it's quite likely. I think over the years we've seen this kind of, you can almost call it the domestication of foreign policy. Again, it relates back to my previous point on the sort of blurring of the lines between practically everything in the sort of modern era. Internal and external security, the distinction is vague these days, even the distinction between peacetime and wartime. So a lot of, again, the West's adversaries don't actually draw a distinction between peacetime and wartime. Everything is an opportunity to subvert, influence, and gain power. So I think it's very likely that we'll just see a continuation of that. Not necessarily because it's something we want to be doing, but something we're kind of compelled to do, almost coerced by the actions of states who are trying to promote their own interests. So, yeah, I think it's a necessary competition that's going to be taking place, let's say, below the threshold of armed conflict.
I think this is something that we've seen as well on the economic side, isn't it? It's about China seeing itself, for example, as being able to be at war and peace at the same time. So it can have a trade war, or it can have an economic conflict, but it can be at peace militarily, or the other way around. It's a sort of yin and yang, isn't it? And is that something, I mean, my personal view would be that this is something that we're going to see more of, that this sort of conflict where we're actually, the world is almost at war, but not at war, in a conventional sense, is going to become more important. And that has a really serious consequence for trade, doesn't it? And for banks, because effectively banks become the boots on the ground in this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, adopting a political risk perspective, if you look at trade and trade finance, we're talking here about the manufacturing industry and the defense industry. This relates to things like procurement. I mean, trade fundamentally is the fuel of conflict. You can't go to war without the manufacturing side of things or this resupply side of things. So it forms a really important part of that side of political risk. You can't necessarily draw a distinction between the things, but yeah, I think we can't ignore the fact that we're going to encounter some issues in the trade and trade finance space in 2021 that perhaps slip below the radar as well. And this is something that I see as being something perhaps a little bit more sinister, because you know, with conflicts in, I don't know, at the moment, for example, conflicts in the Sahel, it's in the news, it's observable. You can look at the statistics that are related to it. But the thing that becomes tricky is when you have more subversive means that actually undermine institutions. They undermine financial institutions as well as sort of political institutions. But that erosion is very, very gradual, because it's about subversion and sort of gradually gaining influence. And this is very much a sort of strategic long game that you see in countries like China, for example, who very much see strategy as something that relates to not our generation and not the next generation, but the generation beyond that. So, you know, whereas if you look at a lot of the doctrine in the United Kingdom, for example, our strategic thinking is 10 years down the line, maybe 20 years down the line tops. Whereas for a lot of other countries, it's, you know, we're talking up to about 100 years down the line. So it's very difficult to compete with that, but it's something that we really have to be aware of.
So, I mean, what do you think against that backdrop? I know what I think against that backdrop, but what are going to be the key things from a foreign policy perspective that are going to define trade? So, I mean, you made the point about the Sahel. We saw the Sahel being important even this time last year. We saw it because we saw the increase in Russian trade in arms and ammunition going into the Sahel. That was something we picked up this time last year, and it's become even more important. The Russian influence there has become very major. Now, that's a big area of potential conflict. Are we seeing any other ones like that? Are we seeing anything around foreign policy, technology, supply chains driving trade in 2021, do you think?
Yeah, well, specifically in terms of countries who are maybe at risk of this, what I'm referring to as this kind of, you know, sub-threshold, this sub-threshold domain, you'll find are actually, a lot of them are actually in Europe. And it's not necessarily that it will spill over into any kind of overt conflict. But you've got countries like Serbia, for example, who are kind of important countries within Europe, but who actually are at the moment purchasing Russian the Pantsir missiles, for example, and conducting war games with Russia, despite being important an important European nation. So in terms of the supply chains as well, I think this probably relates to issues like procurement, defense procurement. Again, like, for example, you have the manufacturer of, let's take, for example, armored vehicles. armored vehicles don't come ready-made. You need the supply chain to actually construct these things. So you can look at one study that we did actually in the not too distant past was on the supply of LED lights to an armored vehicle manufacturer. And one step down the supply chain, these LEDs were produced in Great Britain. One step down from the supply chain, they actually got the LEDs from Germany, and then the components for the LEDs came from China. So at every point of the supply chain, Britain's potential military capabilities and its ability to present a credible and capable deterrent posture all depended on the sort of timely delivery of a tiny LED light. And this is a fascinating concept, and why we need to be talking about things like supply chains in the context of risk, because it's kind of the strategic embodiment of the butterfly effect. You know, an LED light doesn't get delivered on time, so an armored vehicle doesn't get produced on time. So Britain can't produce a sort of capable deterrent posture, say in the Balkans or in the Baltics. So you know, everything has a knock-on effect, and it all relates to trade.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to make the point there as well that in a COVID environment and a post-COVID environment, we're beginning to see a lot happening in terms of the COVID-19 supply chain. So again, you've got things like lipid nanoparticles, which are not being produced in one country and supplied to Belgium, which then means that we can't get the supplies of vaccines over in the UK or around Europe to that same extent. So understanding supply chains and understanding the way in which those supply chains are working all the way around the world, and those distributed supply chains are going to be key drivers of trade during the course of the year, I think.
Yeah, well, maybe I could pose you a question on that, actually. So, I mean, vaccine nationalism is one of these things that's kind of hit the news quite regularly in recent months. So, how do you asked me the question about populism? I mean, you know, populism and nationalism are sort of cousins, aren't they? Mm-hmm. What do you think is what the future holds, the immediate future, 2021, when it comes to things like vaccine nationalism, which is going to be a topic of conversation almost, you know, every day for the foreseeable future?
Absolutely, and I think, you know, we've seen the Moderna vaccine approved today, which is the 8th of January, and immediately we're talking about a US vaccine that's going to take a few months to come into circulation in the UK. People are talking about not wanting to be vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine because it's not manufactured, it's not a UK-based one. They preferentially prefer to be vaccinated with the Oxford one because it's a UK-based one. And we've seen this all the way around the world, and we've seen, you know, a great amount of sort of promotion of one particular type of vaccine in Russia, the Sputnik vaccine. We're seeing an experiment going on in India at the moment where we've got trials of on a mass population going on sort of generic vaccines that are coming out of India, and we've seen similar things happen in China. And I think this geopolitically is a really sad thing to have come out of COVID, because this increase in protectionism, we've seen 94 countries around the world impose restrictions on trade, particularly in relation to COVID-19 supply chains. And that has been very damaging for the nature of trade. We're seeing this even now, where countries, politicians are ordering stuff and promoting that as a nationalistic agenda. And it's become politicized, it really has. And I think this goes to the point that you were making about it going outside of the formal tariff restrictions. It's going into non-tariff barriers now. And it's a reframing of trade. It's not likely to be trade, it's more likely to be scientific research, medical policy, and industrial policy as well. And that can all be sanctioned. It's different types of measures. So it takes all of those things under the surface, which again, like your military point, is strategic, but also very worrying. And I think I think the important thing to go on from there. I mean, obviously we're seeing some big shifts in politics during the course of this year moving ahead. So I mean, we can talk about COVID, and obviously the legacy of COVID has been reducing dependency on supply chains. This whole COVID diplomacy going on, the fear that trade will never pick back up again. But there are big political events. We've seen during the course of the last year an undermining of the big institutions of trade, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, United Nations, NATO even. What are the big political events that are going to either support those structures now internationally or continue to undermine them, do you think?
Yeah, well, perhaps I can start with the positives. I think a lot of the erosion of our trust in institutions and multilateralism in sort of broad brush terms was because of Donald Trump's administration. I mean, the whole America First agenda, I mean, it's a simple point to make, but put everybody else second. So it meant that multilateralism wasn't even a consideration of his in the slightest. And it was based on a very shaky understanding of how the world works, I think. I fundamentally don't think there was the understanding that everything is connected, and that the fortunes of the United States, both in economic and also in security terms, also depended on partners and things as simple as supply chains, but also alliances through NATO. So the cause for optimism, obviously, is a new administration, and an administration that's actually committed to multilateralism as opposed to committed to undermining it. So Biden's presidency, I'm holding out a lot of hope for the building of bridges, or rather the repairing of bridges with a lot of partners. And perhaps a more constructive dialogue between the US and Russia, and the US and China as well. So, I mean, I think there's actually a lot of cause for optimism in 2021. And obviously the big political event is in a couple of weeks' time, less than about a week's time, with Joe Biden's inauguration.
So I think you're right, and I think everybody is taking deep breath after the events of this week, and the events on Capitol Hill, and saying this is now the opportunity for the United States to recalibrate its relationship with the rest of the world. Is it a global policeman? Is it going to resume its role, promoting NATO, promoting rejoining the Paris Climate Accord? These are all incredibly important things. EU relations for the US are going to be very important, particularly around the sustainability agenda. So these are all things that are incredibly important, but surely Biden's main commitment at the beginning of his administration has to be to reunite America, to restore America's trust in itself after the events of the last week. Surely that has to be the biggest thing on his agenda at the moment, or is there something in the foreign policy domain as well?
Well, there is something in the foreign policy domain, but I'll come to that in a second, because I agree with you 100%. Repairing what is an increasingly divided and hurting nation has to be a priority. I mean, I think the whole world watched the events in the Capitol building with shock. I mean, I don't think, regardless of the sentiment that had been sort of whipped up by Donald Trump and his administration, I don't think anybody really truly predicted that. Not anything so brazen. Although the situation was rectified, the response to it has been one of concern, particularly from the sort of Black Lives Matter protests. There was that shocking contrast between how the steps of the Capitol building were, it was the Lincoln Memorial, were protected with the National Guard, these intimidating looking troops standing on the steps, versus how the Capitol building was actually protected, with flimsy barriers. So people are calling into question this almost hypocrisy about how the fight for equal rights for people of all ethnic backgrounds has actually been treated with more of a heavy hand than people who are actually trying to undermine a legitimate democratic process. And I think it exposes the fact that there are still these deep divisions, often along racial lines, in the United States. And Biden is still going to have that at the top of his agenda before America can start thinking about reaching out to allies. It has to be a priority for him.
I was thinking about the US, but I was thinking how this goes back to the point we were making at the beginning about populism, and how actually populism is defining politics and the big political events of this year. Because if you look at Germany as well, they've got elections coming up. This is Germany post-Merkel. It's going to look very different. It looks like the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the anti-European populist party, has started, anti-immigration party, has started to decline in its fortunes, but it's still, Germany's role in Europe is still highly contested. But there's a very great need for the US to have a counterbalancing power in Europe now, if the so-called Western alliance is to pick up. And a lot of that is through trade and sustainability, and maybe even the securitization of sustainability policy by creating those types of alliances. I mean, I don't know whether that figures in what you're thinking about the political events, but it's certainly something there that has resonance from a trade point of view. Yeah.
Well, I mean, absolutely essential, of course. I mean, the UK's status is not necessarily, we shouldn't say weakened, but it's certainly, there's a question mark over what role Britain is going to play in the near future due to Brexit. So yeah, Germany is going to become increasingly important as well. And Merkel's been such a mainstay of German politics. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the elections. But what I was going to talk about is something I touched upon before, which is actually a challenge for Biden that comes within something like 16 days of his inauguration, which is actually to try and resurrect arms control between the US and Russia. So this is the New START, so the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is basically the last safety net in controlling the sort of manufacturing proliferation of strategic nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, something which has crumbled under Trump's administration, but obviously is going to be absolutely crucial to global security, not just to US and Russia, for obvious reasons. We're dealing with nuclear weapons here.
So in a sense, it's another one of these areas where actually we've seen the collapse of global institutions, including treaties and negotiations. And there is cause for optimism because the US will come back into a lot of those treaties. And I think maybe we should just conclude, because otherwise people will get really miserable. To conclude on an optimistic note. Now, I'm fairly optimistic about Brexit now. And I have to say it's the first time in about 4 or 5 years where I felt like this, but I believe that there is now a framework. But now that we've got the politics out of the way, we've got a framework for agreeing an economic arrangement with and actually pulling ourselves closer to Europe again, in terms of trade and in terms of services over the coming years. We'll be doing a lot of, I mean, we're in a suboptimal position. There's no doubt about that in terms of trade now and in terms of lost GDP, but we're in a position where we can negotiate forward because we've defined the sovereignty that the Brexiteers were talking about, and we can move forward from there. Are you able to be that optimistic on the political and military side? Security side?
Yeah, in some respects, but my main concern, obviously, from a security perspective, is the process that the UK now has to go through to maintain the same level of security as it had when it was in the EU. Just going to be harder. So, for example, we've lost access to the European Criminal Records Information System, which is real-time data. We've also lost access to the European Arrest Warrant, and we've been shut out of the SAS2, which basically raises alerts and things on organized crime and also terrorism. So there are, I mean, essentially now what we have to do is we have to have effective coordination in a different way with our European partners. Our objectives are the same. We all want a sort of peaceful and secure Europe, but it is, in my opinion, still going to be slightly more challenging outside of Europe. I mean, Priti Patel said that something like, you know, Britain is going to be safer than it's ever been. And I would just question that because there's no possible way that she can tell. So I think it's important not to be complacent. The deal that was struck, I have to say, was slightly more encouraging than I had expected on the security front. But we have lost access to a number of things that I think improved our security. And yes, we have the ability and the capability to develop our own processes. But just because we're out of EU doesn't mean we're out of Europe. Their interests are still tied to ours security-wise. And I think it's important that we don't forget that.
And maybe coming back on that optimistic note, the hope is that the cohesion, if you like, comes through NATO now. It comes from the fact that we have defined European sovereignty and UK sovereignty, EU sovereignty and UK sovereignty, and it provides a framework for those discussions, which is actually a very positive message to be ending on, because it's a framework that we're able to move forward with, perhaps repairing some of these things. So maybe the UK is in a position to be able to repair some of its relationships. The US, which has also been damaged by 4 years of populism, is in a position to be able to repair the damage in trade and economic and political terms. So maybe 2021 is positive after all.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, just to conclude, I mean, there's a quote by Bertrand Russell, who basically referred to excited times, and I think at the very least, that's the kind of era that we're living in at the moment. It's certainly not boring, and there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Watch this space, right?
Yeah.
I think I'd just summarize by saying mildly optimistic, not hubristic at all. There's a lot of volatility that we can expect during 2021, but hopefully Coriolis Technologies and the insight that we can provide with our multilateral thinking will guide everyone through. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for joining the conversation, Jack.